Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Addressing Challenging Family Dynamics in Caregiving, presented by Homestead and hosted by the American Society on Aging. We'll begin shortly, but first, let's cover a few important notes. The certificate application is accessible immediately after today's webinar on the tab above the presentation screen. When completing your application, be sure to select a certificate type named Credit Reporting Organization and enter your license number named Membership Number. If you do not make a selection, no certificate will be generated. The on-demand recording for today's webinar will be available within 48 hours in your classroom. There will be checkpoints during the webinar to ensure active participation. Please be prepared to respond as they occur. For more information, please review the FAQ document linked in the Announcements tab right below this window. You can also find it in your classroom and our webpage if you need to reference it again. Presentation slides are in the Materials tab. Feel free to download them now or access them in your classroom later on. Ensure you are logged into the webinar with the email address you registered with, or we have no way of tracking your attendance. Your time is logged, and you must view the entire webinar and complete the checkpoints to apply for your certificate. You have 60 days from today to complete a certificate application. For technical assistance, please use the helpline or chat available under the Help tab on top of your screen. For questions about today's presentation, use the Q&A tab below this window. We'll do our best to address these in the last few minutes of the webinar. And now I would like to introduce today's presenter. Lakeland Eichenberger, gerontologist and caregiving advocate at Homestead. With a doctorate from the University of Nebraska, Lakeland is a renowned speaker and expert in the elder care. We are excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great day, a wonderful summer. I know, at least where I live in the Midwest, we finally have a break from the heat. Oh, it is sweet relief to have some cooler weather. So I hope that you also are having cooler weather. I'm, again, so happy that you're joining me today for this topic. It is one that is tricky because families come in all shapes and sizes, and many of us in our professions, we interact with the family of the older adults that we support. And we could probably all write a book on some of the wild, crazy family dynamics that we have seen in our careers. And these can be really challenging and nuanced situations to navigate. So we know that caregiving is emotionally challenging, it's logistically challenging, and even, some of the most harmonious families, the ones that have never really had a history of drama or challenges, once they're thrust into caregiving, all of a sudden, these issues and challenges can quickly spin out of control or just create some challenging situations that families have to navigate. And often they come to us as professionals in the field for our advice and our guidance. So hopefully today we can provide you with some tips and information on how to help families navigate these challenging, complex situations that they face. So let's take a look at the objectives for today's presentation. So we're going to go over some hot button issues that often cause emotional discussions amongst family members. And I have specifically chosen 5 to tackle today because there's so many. I mean, we could talk for hours, probably an entire day's symposium on all of the challenges that occur. So we're going to zero in on 5 specifically. I'm also going to help talk us through some strategies for families to navigate these issues while keeping the focus on what is best for the older adult in the family. I think that should always be our focus. And sometimes that can help be the guiding light to some of this decision making. And then, of course, leave you with some tips and resources for these challenging situations. But first, I think it's helpful to kind of understand family caregiving at a very high level. And for some, this might be a review. But we know as a person gets older, family is typically the first to step in and provide extra support and care. And usually that responsibility falls first to a primary caregiver. So one person is generally the one that's providing the most care and support. And then there's often some secondary caregivers, other people within the family unit that steps up to provide care. Often we find that first the spouse takes on caregiving responsibilities, and if the spouse is no longer living or unavailable to provide care, maybe due to their own health conditions, then it falls to the adult children. And we see commonly the adult daughter as the most common caregiver. But that's changing a little bit. We're seeing more males take on the caregiving role. And so I know next year, the Caregiving in the US report 2025 by the National Alliance for Caregiving, they're coming out with the new statistics around family caregiving. And I always anxiously await that report. I'm on their board of directors, and I know that they always have some great data and insights. And so I'll be curious to see if the number of male caregivers is growing. But I think what's also interesting to take into account when we think about families that are navigating these challenges is that the caregiver pool is shrinking. We know that the population is aging, the birth rate is declining, and so we're seeing that, there used to be 7 caregivers for every 1 older adult in the US. And that number is said to shrink to 4 caregivers to every 1 older adult by the year 2030, which is really just about five and a half years away. And then by 2050, that number is going to shrink even more to just 3 caregivers for every 1 older adult. And I think about kind of the ripple effect of that. And even within my own family, if you've listened to one of my webinars before, you might have heard me talk about this, but my grandma is one of 12 children. And then my dad is one of 6. I'm one of 4. And so far, me and my siblings have 1 to 2 children each. So you can kind of see how there's like that pyramid effect of how does families, they're not having as many children. And so there's less younger people within family units to care for the aging number of relatives. And so that can pose some significant challenges. And then also people are spread out. They're living about, on average, there's at least 1 adult child that lives 280 miles from an aging parent. And for some families, all of the children might be dispersed across the country or even across the world. I know long distance caregiving across borders or overseas is becoming more common. And so these, again, create some challenges and some interesting family dynamics. And, with less people within the family unit to care for the aging family members, there's going to be an increased need for support and resources for services that support those aging family members. And then if we look at kind of the big picture numbers, if we were to put a dollar amount to the value of caregiving in the US, it would be $470 billion. So we know the care that families are providing their aging loved ones. It's so, so important. And just think of this number, if it was added to, our country's budget or growing debt, whatnot, that would be significant. So I think it's so important that we support family caregivers. And I think it's also interesting to see at the various levels of government how there is being more attention put onto family caregiving. I know in my state, I live in Nebraska, there was actually, I think is the second in the nation for a family caregiver tax credit that will start in the new year in 2025. And so I hope to see more of that on a state and national level. But anyway, when we look at the number of family caregivers, there's over 53 million adults that serve as an informal caregiver. And then there's over 16 million people caring for someone living with dementia. And I call that out specifically because we see more challenges, more stress, strain, burden on caregivers of someone living with dementia or another type of cognitive impairment. And so we need to make sure that they have the supports that they need as well. And then I kind of like to talk about the trajectory of caregiving in kind of 3 buckets because we know every family caregiving journey is different, but we do see some commonalities. And so I'm going to put up a poll for this question because I'm curious to see in the work that you all do and those that are listening, what type of caregiving do you see most commonly in the families that you work with? So first we have kind of gradual caregiving. It's that pink line. It's really how caregiving over time increases. So for example, you might start out just going over to check on your loved one every so often, maybe a couple times a month. And then as they age, as their needs increase, you're maybe going over a couple times a week. And then it becomes every day. And then all of a sudden they really need around the clock care. And so sometimes it's called caregiver creep. So just over time, your caregiving role gradually increases as a family member. So that is one common kind of trajectory of caregiving that I come across. The next is a crisis occurs. Maybe there's a fall that lands an older adult in the hospital. Maybe there's a stroke or a heart attack. Maybe there's a diagnosis of cancer or dementia. And all of a sudden, overnight, the family realizes the older adult needs more help, needs more support, or they're going home from the hospital and they're scrambling. And so that's kind of what I call the crisis caregiving trajectory, is just there's a crisis overnight, the family is thrust into caregiving. And then sometimes we see short-term assistance for things like maybe a planned procedure, like a hip or knee replacement, or something that maybe is outpatient, and then the family needs to kind of rally around that older person for a few weeks or a few months to help get them through that kind of event. And then everyone kind of goes back to their regular family role. So I'm very curious, if you haven't taken the poll already, let's launch that to see which caregiving trajectory we see most commonly. And it's looking like crisis is becoming kind of the leader, but there's quite a few that see gradual as well. So right now we have about 60% are saying crisis. That's what I am seeing most often. And about 40% of you are saying gradual. And we have just a couple, about 5% saying, I do see that short-term assistance. And I'm sure you see all of these trajectories in the work that you do. But it's really interesting for me to just kind of know what you're seeing most commonly. And I know at Home Instead, when we get calls for home care, it's usually at that crisis. They're headed home from the hospital, there's been a fall, and so they need care and support now. They needed it yesterday. So I'm guessing that's kind of a similar situation to those of you that are listening. And you'll have to pardon me for a second. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, so I'm just going to take a moment and thank you all for participating in that poll. I really appreciate it. Okay, so when we think about families, we hope that no matter what trajectory they're on, we hope that they have had conversations about aging, about how the person wants to age. But we know in reality that's not always the case. Many families wait for that crisis. They wait for an emergency to have the discussion. So a while back at Home Instead, we did some kind of market research and found 68% of families wait too long before discussing and planning care or end-of-life issues. And often, about 70% of the time, they wait for that emergency situation. That crisis puts them into planning mode. And think about it. When you're in a crisis, emotions are heightened. You don't have a lot of time to make decisions. You don't have a lot of time to research. So is the family in those moments making the best decision for the older adult? Does the older adult have the opportunity to express their wishes and desires? And does the family have the time to make sure that those wishes are carried out? And so I am a huge proponent of planning ahead, as I'm sure many of you are. But the reality is many people are waiting. So if we're working with families and we're working with them early on before that crisis, we have great opportunity to encourage discussion and planning around some of these issues that come up in aging in these family units. And if we can do a lot of that planning ahead of time, have those conversations, then hopefully we can reduce some of the stress, strain, burden, conflict that tends to exist. And when we think about the impact that caregiving can have on individuals and families, these are some of the most common things that we see. We see it's emotionally stressful. There are highs and lows, all sorts of emotions come into play. We know it can be physically demanding depending on the level of care that the person physically needs. Also, it can be physically demanding in terms of things like sleep deprivation and that kind of thing as well. Physically just exhausting. It can also be financially straining. We know that not everyone has planned for retirement or has enough savings to carry out some of the needs or to support the person in their needs. And so it can create some financial strain. A lot of family caregivers are spending money out of their own pockets to pay for the care of their aging loved one. We know also family members have competing demands. So while we see that kind of pool of family caregivers shrinking, we also know that those family caregivers are working. They're raising their own children, so they're sandwiched in between caring for parents, aging parents, and caring for their own children. So they're trying to balance a lot. They have a lot of competing demands on their time in addition to their caregiving role. And then you throw in those family dynamics. And that can create a lot of challenges, a lot of stress and strain. But if we can give families tools and resources, if we can help them think through the family dynamics and how everyone can best contribute, then hopefully we can reduce some of that stress and strain that could potentially be caused by these family dynamics. But if we look more closely at the family dynamics when it comes to caregiving, again, every family is unique and different. It can bring families together or it can pull families apart. I've seen it happen both ways. Of course, it's always heartbreaking to see when it pulls families apart, but we know that that can be a reality. Another hard reality is that the care is rarely, if ever, balanced or fair. There's usually always one person in the family that carries the heaviest load when it comes to caregiving. So maybe it's the one that lives closest to the older individual. Maybe it's the one that works in a profession that, traditionally people associate with older adults, like if you work in the field of aging like I do, I'm sure many of you also are the one in the family that's coordinating, answering a lot of those questions. Or maybe there's a family member that works in healthcare. And so that person is kind of the default, and a lot of the care responsibilities fall to them. We know that about 43% of families have one sibling that's responsible for providing most of the care, and only 2% of families admitted to splitting the caregiving responsibility evenly. And so that's a really low number. I hope that increases. I hope that, and again, that splitting of responsibilities is relative, because what might seem fair in one family may seem very unfair in another family. But 1 in 4 caregivers also report that there's an intense strife in at least kind of one area of family conflict when it comes to family dynamics. And so no matter really if the care is perceived as being kind of balanced or unbalanced, there is usually some strife that happens within families and some challenging family dynamics. And so when we look specifically at siblings, because I think that is a very common scenario where there are multiple siblings that are that have an aging parent or loved one, we see some things occur. So we see 46% of siblings say that their relationships have deteriorated with other siblings that are unwilling to help. If you think about that, that's a question I get asked a lot. How do I get my siblings to help? They won't help. They're not engaged. And that's really, really frustrating, especially if you're that primary caregiver that's doing a lot of the work. And 42% of family caregivers give themselves and their siblings a below average grade for their ability to divide that workload evenly. And so, that's also, well, one, that's kind of great that they're self-aware that they're not fair, but that's also an area of opportunity. How can we help families explore how to split up the care a little bit more evenly so that there isn't the one caregiver doing it all, or maybe we can find creative ways to help split it more evenly. I thought this statistic was interesting. 46% of youngest siblings were the primary caregivers, compared to 57% of the oldest siblings. and then about 49% of middle siblings. So I think that is interesting because, historically we have seen it's like the oldest adult daughter who would take on the care, but we're also seeing obviously youngest siblings or that middle sibling as well. I think again, there's a lot of dynamics that go into play as to who is that primary caregiver. But in my family, I'm the oldest daughter. I'm the oldest, I'm a daughter, and I work in the aging field. So I'm sure that I will be the primary caregiver. And I live closest to my parents. And my mom and I are very close. And so, I mean, it's when they get to that point, it'll be something that I will, be in a position to take on. But me and my siblings joke about how I'm kind of the perfect candidate for the primary caregiver. But when I look at my own family, my grandma, she has 6 children, as I mentioned, and she currently lives with one of my aunts. And my aunt is divorced. She has a teenage daughter and some other children that are in college and out of college. And my aunt acts as the primary caregiver. But I think that my family has done a pretty good job of helping as secondary caregivers. There's one or two of the brothers that kind of help with the financial side of things. We have an aunt that's a nurse, and so she kind of helps with those healthcare appointments. Another aunt, she lives long distance, but she comes to visit and kind of gives some respite and a break. And then another uncle, he loves to cook and is a gardener and a really handy guy. So he fixes meals. He comes over to the house and fixes things around the house. And so they really have found ways to kind of split up that care. But there have been some issues even within that have not necessarily caused challenge. I guess I would call it a challenge, but not necessarily to the point of strife yet. But there have been some things that the family has had to sit down and discuss. And so what also I think is important to consider is that as families kind of work through this process of caring for an older adult, there are some shifts between kind of that family role that has been traditionally held as the adult child or as the spouse. And then there's that transition into the caregiving role. And there is actually a theory built around this. If you haven't heard of this caregiver identity theory by Montgomery and Kozlowski, it's really interesting. There's these 5 phases. And so in this example, I show the spouse or adult child in phase 1, really starting out in that mainly traditional family role of being a spouse or being an adult child. And at the beginning of kind of this caregiving journey, caregiving is really only a fraction of their time, of their identity. And that's in that turquoise the turquoise represents the caregiving role. The tan is the family role. So then as you, of course, move into phase 2, caregiving becomes about a quarter of your kind of role and identity. You start taking on more kind of caregiving related tasks. And by phase 3, about half of your time, you're feeling like a caregiver, the other half like an adult child. And then you get to phase 4 and that caregiving role is starting to really take over, and you feel like that is now your primary role, and you've really lost that adult child relationship with your parent. Now you're just feeling like the caregiver, or you've lost that spousal relationship. And that can be really hard to grapple with. And so sometimes sharing a slide like this with a family and asking them, hey, where do you identify on this? How much of your time do you feel like you're dedicating to caregiving? How much do you feel like you're able to still be in that family spouse role? Because I think what's interesting about phase 5, you'll notice that the caregiving role kind of shrinks back, and some of the family role has come back. And what's happening in phase 5 is when support and resources are introduced into the equation. So in that phase, if we can get families to a place where they're utilizing things like home care or respite, or perhaps some of the other siblings or family members are chipping in to help divide more evenly the roles and responsibilities, and that can give back some of that family role. And so sometimes this slide can be helpful also in just helping people come to terms with the fact that their role has changed. It is emotional. I'm sure you've heard of like the anticipatory grief, or oh goodness, the term is escaping me. But when you're grieving, somebody, how somebody once was, especially like in dementia or Alzheimer's, there is a lot of emotions wrapped up in this. So sometimes just being able to identify, to pause, because sometimes caregivers are so busy and caught up, pause and recognize, okay, where am I in my caregiving journey? What do I need? What could help me regain back some of my balance or some of my family role that I'm really longing for or missing or searching for? And sometimes we can help them kind of find some of that balance again. But we also know that even again, in the best of families, in the most harmonious of families, there can be family conflict. And so let's talk through some of these contributing factors of conflict. Of course, you have the first one, somebody's limited availability or willingness to help. And sometimes this can occur for a variety of reasons. And it could be that there is a financial or physical limitation that can hinder a person's ability to support or assist with caregiving. Or there's some that really just outright don't want to take on the caregiving role or refuse. Others might also want to help out, but they really just don't know how. And again, the reality is one person generally takes on the role. And so it can create some resentment and some tension. Pardon me. We also know that the makeup of families today is evolving. We see more divorce amongst all stages of life. We see more later life marriages and blended families. Also, we see older adults that maybe are partnered up and cohabitate with a significant other, or maybe even just a good friend. And all of these life events can introduce new family members and or individuals into this family dynamic, and it really sometimes it can strengthen bonds, but it can also create new sources of tension. And so these can create some really complex family dynamics, and there can be issues around who should provide care, how should the responsibilities be divided, and some of these situations can become heated. I remember a client that I worked with. They had their father had a girlfriend, and so all of a sudden the girlfriend was moving in and she had some cognitive decline, and these adult children, for both of the older adults, they never grew up together. They never had even met each other really until after they had already decided to move in together. And there was a lot of tension and conflict because the female who had cognitive impairment, she really needed more support, and the daughter of the male, the older adult, she knew that living together made her dad happy, but she also knew that they needed some home care, some in-home support in order to continue to live together. But the son of the woman, he really was out of the loop, didn't recognize the changes in his mom, and it really just led to a lot of conflict. It led to tears. I felt like a little bit like a therapist during that situation, but we were able to kind of talk it through, help the siblings come together and have discussion. And so I'm sure many of you have stories like that, especially because we're seeing more and more of these family dynamics that are changing. We also see that there is more care that family members are having to provide. So for some, there's a lack of knowledge and skills to provide the care. So maybe the loved one needs more day-to-day support with bathing, grooming, restroom assistance, and maybe family members aren't comfortable with that. So maybe they need to start looking into services like home care or bath aid to come in and help support. Or maybe there are more medical related tasks that they just don't feel comfortable doing. And so maybe they need some more training on how to do that to feel more comfortable. So that could be a part of this puzzle. We also know that there are those competing demands that I mentioned earlier. People are juggling a lot, they have a lot on their plate, and then you add caregiving, and then a lot of guilt can start to boil up because they're feeling pulled in the direction of caregiving and have less time to spend with their own family and those types of things. Or maybe work becomes overwhelming and you see a lot more of what we call presenteeism, where you're physically present at work, but your mind is on your caregiving duties. We also see that there's more opportunity for communication breakdown. We know how important communication is in so many aspects of our life. But in family caregiving, we can see sometimes how one maybe misunderstanding can snowball into larger disputes. And I've oftentimes seen families get to that point of like, I don't even know why we're fighting or where this started, but there was at one point somebody said something and it blew up, and here we are. We're in this really kind of tumultuous family dynamic. We also know that a lot of this can happen because of the heightened emotions that can arise because of this issue, especially when you're watching a loved one decline or go through a really tough diagnosis. There's a lot of those emotions wrapped up. And so it's important that we get the emotional support for the family caregiver as well. There also might be that unresolved or ongoing conflict, or there's maybe a family history of conflict. Sometimes these things are rooted many, many years before the caregiving arises. And for some, that term loved one, I admittedly say it a lot, caring for your loved one, that can be hard for some people because there might have been some, of that family history of conflict that have led to things like neglect or abuse or those kinds of things. And so the term loved one might not be the right term to use in some of these family dynamics. It might be the person that you're caring for, because there might not be that sense of love amongst all family members. And this can lead to, those unresolved or ongoing conflicts that can make things challenging for families to come together when it's really needed most, when the older adult in the family needs care and support. We also see pride and stubbornness. At least I have seen that come into play. Some of these aging individuals, and rightly so, hang on so fiercely to their independence and resist help and support. And so, a family, despite all of their best efforts to get extra care into the home, might be met with resistance by the older individual. And so while they're trying to get the family the help and care and support that they need, that pride or stubbornness might really stop them kind of dead in their tracks. We also know sometimes there are difficult or toxic personalities that can be hard to deal with, and it can be very wearing on the primary caregiver. That can create some tension. We also sometimes see caregivers who have kind of that perfectionist mentality, or they think that they need to be in control of every aspect of caregiving. And so they don't want others to help, because then they're letting go of some of that control. And that can be something that's really tough to kind of overcome. We also sometimes see favoritism still occurring in these family dynamics. So a parent maybe has always had a favorite child that they have favored or preferred. Maybe they want them to be the primary caregiver, but maybe that person lives in another state. And so the other child, who's more local, really should be the primary caregiver. But again, that tension starts to boil because of that favoritism. We also need to keep into consideration cultural and generational differences as well. There can be some misunderstandings, some strained relationships. We see, especially in the LGBTQ community, that some families, they might have cut ties with their biological family, and they may have started to develop connections or others to support them that aren't blood-related family, their chosen family. And so these things are things we need to be aware of. Or there are certain cultures that have very strong ideas around how their elderly should be cared for. And so we need to be aware of those and how family dynamics kind of play into all of that, or just be aware of what are some of those barriers and challenges that might arise. And then the final one on this list is underappreciation. Some family caregivers might feel like their loved one doesn't appreciate all that they're doing. They feel like they're giving, and the older adult themselves or the other siblings, they don't realize what all goes into it. And so they feel underappreciated, and it can lead to a whole host of emotions, resentment, and whatnot. And so why do we talk about these conflicts? I think it's the outcomes of conflict that really are of utmost importance to consider, because often when there is conflict, at times the needs of the older adult can go unmet. And that is the last thing that we want to occur, especially for those of us that work in this industry. We want to make sure that the older adult is treated with dignity and respect and has the support and care that they need. But sometimes family conflict can lead to indecision. There might be support that is needed, but the family is arguing about how much it's going to cost and what company to use and yada, yada, the schedule. And then the older adult goes without that care, and then there's a fall. And then that leads to a whole other host of problems. And so sometimes that indecision can really lead to unintended neglect, maybe even some abuse. And so we really want to avoid all of those things, of course. It can also lead to resentment. We talked already about that. These kind of things can boil up, especially if the caregiver is asking for help and they feel like they are not getting the help that they need. It really reminds me of this family that I worked with at one point. The primary caregiver lived with the father, who had some sort of cognitive decline. It wasn't diagnosed, but the family could see him declining. He was needing more and more care. And there was a brother halfway across the country, and he would come visit regularly. And every time he did, he would say, well, Dad seems fine to me. I took him out for breakfast, and, we had a great time. We had a great chat. And the primary caregiver, the local daughter that was living with him, was getting so frustrated because he wasn't seeing the day-to-day things that she was doing for him to really set him up for success and help him really maintain his independence. And so, to the brother, it looked like Dad was doing great, but behind the scenes, the sister was doing a lot to help. And so sometimes in those scenarios, it can be helpful to ask the out-of-town sibling to come and stay for a few days and to take on a lot of that caregiving so that they can see truly what day-to-day is like. We also can see an outcome of conflict in terms of severed relationships. And we also can see that regret and that guilt. And then in some extreme cases, we can see legal action as well. Sometimes, especially after the passing of the older adult, we can see that sometimes there is that kind of legal action that takes place, or in the distribution of assets, a lot of that resentment and guilt and regret all kind of boils to the surface. And we don't have time to get into that today, but that can occur. Okay, so I wanted to go through quickly the 5 hot button issues that I see commonly. And so I thought it'd be interesting to do a quick poll before we dive into this. Again, there's so many that we could cover, but I wanted to kind of zero in on 5. And so I think for this question, you can check all that apply. But what are you seeing most commonly as a hot button issue for families? So we have health issues, we have financial issues, we have independence, and that would be independence of the older adult. They're clinging to that independence. Distance, and I would say I'm going to talk about distance in a kind of a twofold. Distance in terms of long distance caregiving, but also distance in terms of close quarters. So having the loved one move in, the older loved one move in. So we'll talk about distance in 2 kind of categories. And then the last one I wanted to go over is boundary setting. So I'll pause for a second. and let you all select which ones you're seeing most common. Okay, it looks like finances are coming in closely trailed by independence and health. So that's interesting. And that's really no surprise to me. I know finances, a lot of issues can kind of boil up around that. So thank you all. And if you have any other topics that I haven't mentioned yet, if you want to put it in the Q&A, I'd be really curious to hear, what are some of the other hot button issues that you experience in your roles that where family dynamics come into play. So beyond the ones that I've already chatted about, please feel free in the Q&A to kind of drop in some additional hot topics that you're seeing. Okay, so let's jump into health. So when an older person becomes ill or experiences a decline, it really can leave families facing all sorts of kind of potentially difficult issues. Who will provide the additional care? How will the care be divided? A lot of times families might have differences or opinions on the type of care the older loved one should or should not receive, or maybe they disagree on the quality. And so again, sometimes in these cases, these families can turn to us as healthcare professionals, as senior care professionals, for kind of tiebreakers, so to speak. And so, of course, it's important for us to stay neutral and objective and really help the family focus on what are the needs of the older adult, what's going to be best for the older adult, help to present them with the options, and then help them, move towards a decision. But to further complicate sometimes, we also see changes in conditions of an individual. So, for example, in a case of Alzheimer's or dementia, we know that there is generally decline. And so there's going to be changes in their condition and their capabilities. And so sometimes it's a source of conflict. Should we allow mom or dad to continue driving? We know that they're progressing through the stages of dementia. At what point do we take away the car keys? We also know that our healthcare system, especially here in the US, is complex. And so often a primary caregiver really is needed to help coordinate that care. And so there could, again, be disputes that arise amongst families on, which healthcare system to use or which doctor to see, or it might be hard to, coordinate and get the older adult to all of their healthcare appointments and to sit in on the appointment and take the notes and then report back out to the family. It can be a lot. We also, again, know that there can be resistance or stubbornness that an older adult might exhibit when it comes to things like following doctor's orders. Maybe they have said, you really need to cut back on your sugar or sodium, but the older adult themselves doesn't want to, heed those recommendations. So that can be a source of conflict. Or maybe they don't want to take their medications, or maybe they're starting to refuse to bathe or groom, or maybe they don't want to make necessary changes to prevent things like falls in the home. And so that point of contention can be in terms of resistance. We also sometimes see substance abuse, whether or not an older adult should be allowed to have liquor in the home, or maybe the family is kind of turning a blind eye to an issue that can potentially be there. We know as a person ages, they process things like alcohol and other substances differently. And so, that 1 or 2 glasses of wine that they used to always have at night, maybe that's increasing their fall risk, but the family may not realize, or maybe one caregiver is saying we need to stop that, and another caregiver is saying, oh, they're at the end of life, let them live life. And so there could be some conflict that arises there. We also know cognitive decline can be a source of contention, especially if there's denial around the issue of cognitive decline, or the family is really unsure on how to address it. I know I've talked to so many families where they want their loved one to get a cognitive evaluation, but they won't go to the doctor. That is a huge one. And so I always encourage a variety of approaches to that. And I know I recently did a webinar on Alzheimer's and dementia, so please go back and watch that one for some tips. There also might be conflict that arises around end of life, whether or not to go on to hospice or use palliative care, whether or not the loved one should pursue that aggressive treatment for cancer or just opt for palliative and comfort care, those kinds of decisions. And there can be, this is really just scratching the surface. There is a lot of other issues that can bubble up underneath that category. And then we turn to finances. We know that there's no surprise that money complicates things at any stage of life, let alone when we're dealing with aging loved ones and the needed care and support. And so they might have to make really, really tough decisions, or there might be disagreements over financial matters. There might also be one adult child or family member that's the healthcare power of attorney and a different one that's a financial power of attorney. And so there might be some source of conflict there. They might, as a family, disagree on how to spend money. Some might have that primary caregiver might have caregiving expenses that the others within the family unit don't necessarily see. So there might be some disagreements on, okay, should everyone have to chip in on those? Can we take money from the older adult savings to help cover some of those expenses that the family caregiver, the primary caregiver is taking on, those kinds of things. And then unfortunately, sometimes we see that family members zero in on their inheritance, and so they don't want to spend money on some of the care because they want to reserve it for their inheritance, which always just breaks my heart. And then again, we know that those financial power of attorney can be so important, and it's really crucial that families keep those documents up to date, especially if there's a change in the family, like a death of a spouse. Okay, do we have an updated power of attorney for finance, or do we need to select someone new if the current person that's the financial POA has a diagnosis or maybe moved out of state or something of that nature? And then sometimes the source of conflict is a lack of insight into an older adult's finances. I mean, if you think about it, in many families, money is not something that's talked about, or the adult parent doesn't want the adult child to know how the state of their finances. But it can be imperative in a lot of cases to know, okay, what do we have available to make sure that we can get the care and support? And so sometimes that's when you need to bring in the financial planner or professional to help facilitate some of those conversations. And then there might also be a lack of understanding on the options to pay for care. And again, this is when it can be helpful for them to come to people like us who know the options out there to pay for care. Okay, the next one is independence. Oh my goodness, I could talk about this forever. I have a lot of slides left, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly. I apologize. But we know that there are two things that older adults want as they age. They want to be able to be independent as long as possible, and they also don't want to be a burden on family. And so this can make things really challenging, especially when they need more care and support. And I often see this in kind of three specific areas: one around driving, another around living environments, and then third around falls. And so when it comes to driving, there can be a disagreement within families on when the person should stop driving, who should have that conversation. Okay, they have to stop driving. Well, now what? Who's going to get them to their appointments and where they want to go? So that can definitely be a source of conflict. When it comes to the living environment, if they have challenges with keeping up with their household, now who's going to pitch in and start to help? Should they stay home? Should they move? Sometimes this is where that resistance to care can come in. The family recognizes, okay, they do need some help, but they won't let any stranger come into the home. They want the family to be the ones to provide the care, and that can be really a source of contention. And then that last one around falls, they might have a fear of falling. They might be afraid to tell their family that they did fall or had a near fall where they, tripped and caught themselves, because they don't want their family to jump to the conclusion of, oh, well, we got to move them out of the home. That's a real fear. They want to cling on to that independence. But at the same time, they might be unwilling to take measures to reduce the risk of falls, like putting in grab bars or using the walker, that sort of thing. And that's where this dignity and risk concept comes into play. If you haven't heard of it, it's really interesting. It's that balance between keeping them safe and preserving their dignity. And that can be an issue that comes up a lot in these family conflicts. All right, I mentioned I was going to talk about distance, both long and extra close. So long distance, they might feel left out if it's a long distance caregiver. They might want to contribute, but they don't know how. Or if they do start to ask questions, they might be that perception of meddling on the part of the primary caregiver. They also might not get the whole picture, and that example I mentioned earlier. But can we find ways to allow them to help from afar? Can they do some of the maybe bill pay or ordering things off Amazon and having them shipped to the house? Can they find ways to call in every day and provide some socialization, or fly in for a week and provide respite so the primary caregiver can get away? And then when we think of close quarters, living with an aging relative can sometimes take a toll. You never have time off. Balancing also caregiving with the needs of a child or a spouse can also be where that tension can come into play. And then there's also concerns around privacy. When you're living in close quarters, is all parties involved getting the privacy that they're wanting and needing? So some interesting conflict can arise there. And then finally, under the boundaries category, I did an entire podcast on this episode. I have a podcast called Caregiver Chats. And if you download these slides, I linked to it. You can also just search Caregiver Chats in your favorite podcast app. But I'm going to quickly go through this, but I encourage you to go listen to that episode because a lot of interesting topics came up. But, there are some boundaries that might need to be set for there to be a healthy relationship between the caregiver and care recipient. So often the family members, they give up a lot to accommodate the care of their aging loved one or the care recipient. But are there things the care recipient can do to accommodate the needs of the caregiver? If you think about relationships, they're often reciprocal. And so can there be a little give and take to create more of that balance or the boundaries that are needed? And we know that these boundaries can also help outline what the family is and is not willing to provide in terms of the care. And maybe that's where support like home care can come in. Maybe the line is drawn at giving a bath, and so you need somebody to come in and help with the bath. It's also important to differentiate between needs and wants. Sometimes an older family member might want a lot of things, but do they really need it? Are those wants getting to be so much that it's causing a lot of burnout and resentment? Can we peel it back and say, okay, what are the true needs, and make sure that those needs are met? And then let's talk about the wants. And then sometimes it can be helpful for the whole family to sit down and think about the priorities of the older adult and of the rest of the family. And can we set some healthy boundaries to preserve some of the energy and capacity for the caregiver? Okay, so we talked a lot about the conflicts. Now let's talk about how we navigate them. Of course, conducting regular family meetings can be so helpful. Keeping that focus on the older adult and their needs, their current issues, the current situation can be a great way to kind of keep focus on that guiding light. Let's leave those grievances, those conflicts aside. Let's focus on what our older adult family member needs now. And also involve the older adult. Ask them, what are your goals? Is your goal to stay at home? Okay, well, in order to make that happen, here are the things we're going to need to talk about. What are you willing to do to help meet your goal of staying at home? Are you open to having home care come in? Because, between us kids, adult children, we can't be here around the clock, and we need some help to make sure that you can stay at home. So sometimes it's the way that you kind of phrase things, get them thinking about it from a different perspective, and also realize that everyone will have different perspectives. And it's important to allow space for those to be shared, to keep open communication. But at the end of the day, it's really helpful to define roles and responsibilities and play on people's strengths. If there's people within the family that are great cooks, have them cook a meal and bring it over. Or if there's somebody that is really great at the yard work. Have them take over the yard or the snow removal. Find ways to play on people's strengths so that they are contributing in a way that's meaningful. You can also set those boundaries. Again, accept help from the outside, utilize resources. But one really important thing is to also be flexible. We know that the care of an older adult, it can change in a moment's notice because of a health event, a diagnosis. And so staying flexible can be really important. And also, there might be a point where we need to say, okay, let's let go of old grievances. Let's get to a point of acceptance in the effort to best care for our older loved one. And so sometimes that needs to happen. Also, having kind of a family meeting checklist can be really helpful. Set a clear purpose for the meeting. Maybe today we're going to be talking about mom's latest doctor's appointment and all the things that we now need to do per the doctor's orders. So that could be the purpose of the meeting. But within the meeting, you want to identify and list the needs, prioritize those needs. You need to research the options. And hopefully, if we're planning ahead, if we're doing this ahead of a crisis, we'll have the luxury of time to do some of the research. But then make decisions together and also try to divide that workload. Again, plan ahead, be flexible, and then plan a follow-up meeting or check-in or determine how are we going to continue ongoing communication. Maybe it's a text message string or an email list or utilizing, there's a lot of different apps out there. And if you know of a good one, please drop it in the Q&A. But communication is key. Understand the situation, over communicate. Also have empathy, put yourselves in the older adult's shoes or in your sibling's shoes that lives long distance. How would you want to be treated if you needed this type of care? And it's important to remember that the older adult is still an individual, an older adult. They need to be respected. We need to treat them with dignity and not like a child. And so very important to keep in mind. You can also pay close attention to people's body language. That can sometimes say more than words. And then also be honest. Sometimes, to be honest, Mom, like if we don't get this home care in, or if we don't, look into X, Y, and Z, then we're going to have a bigger issue or something like that ahead of us. And so if we don't put in grab bars, the thing is you could fall and break a hip. That's common. We know we don't want that to happen. So let's talk about what we can do to keep you safe. So sometimes just starting with that phrase of, to be honest, can sometimes be helpful. And then also ask for help. Look into those community resources. Many of us on the call are those community resources for things like home care, home health care, bringing in the healthcare provider. Sometimes even, family therapy for some families can be helpful, working with a geriatric care manager, and then also a professional mediator can be really, really helpful in some situations, or working with an elder law attorney or financial advisor. Those professionals that really it's their job to help families navigate some of these things. So tapping into those resources can be extremely helpful. At Home Instead, we have a number of free resources that can help families. We have a free downloadable home care solutions guide that goes through what home care is, how to pay for it. Sometimes that can help get family all on the same page of, okay, what is home care? Well, read through this guide and then we can talk about it as a family. We also have a home safety checklist that takes you room by room through the home that can help identify maybe some small fixes to make the home safer and enhance that independence that many older people want to preserve. And then when we talk about planning ahead, we also have an action plan for successful aging. So you can find all of these things free and downloadable on our website, homeinstead.com. And then also this final slide I have up here is all about resources. There's some mediation resources. I also listen to the Caregiver Chats podcast. I talk a lot about these kind of family dynamics and challenging situations on the podcast. Of course, your area agency on aging, and then the Aging Life Care Association. They are a group of geriatric care managers. Their website is great if you're trying to find geriatric professional in your area. And so again, tapping into those resources can be helpful. Having that third party come in, help everyone kind of assess what's going on, what are the needs, prioritizing them, and then helping families create a plan that can be so, so helpful. So I know that I talked a lot. I could talk about this topic for days on end. It's so interesting to me, and helping families identify these sources of conflict and hopefully overcome them. That's always a very gratifying thing to be able to do. And so I hope that today I've helped to provide some insights for you all and help provide some ideas on how can we overcome some of these conflicts. So with that, Jamie, I know I only left us like 30 seconds for questions, but if there is any questions, I'm happy to take them. And I'm excited to go back through the chat and see all of the things that you typed in as additional resources or sources of conflict that you see.
Thank you, Lakeland. So we don't have a lot of time, but I did just want to ask this one question because it was a super popular one. We got multiple questions around what suggestions can you offer when siblings seem to be in denial about the actual caregiving situation, the true level of health of aging adult, trajectory of aging process, and the need for additional support.
Gosh, that is really, really hard. I think that it's hard to generalize because every situation is so, so different. But I think, speaking from our experience as professionals in what we tend to see can sometimes be really helpful. So sometimes, storytelling sticks with people. And so while, of course, we don't want to use people's names or anything like that. We want to be HIPAA compliant and whatnot. But if we can say, I saw a family in a very similar situation to yours, and here's what happened because they did not do X, Y, and Z. I really don't want your family to have similar outcomes. Would you be willing to, have a conversation around some of the things that are being observed and be very factual. Try to keep emotions out of it because we know emotions can really quickly get people riled up. But, say, these are some things that we've been noticing. There has been this diagnosis from the doctor. There has been X number of falls. There's been 2 car accidents or fender benders in the last couple months. Kind of laying out and painting the picture, and again, trying to help them to see the big picture, and kind of approaching it from that kind of prevention side of things, and again, also, talking through what the goals are of the older adult or the family. That can also be that kind of guiding light to help them all hopefully align. But it is common to see that denial, but hopefully some of those tips can help. So great question. And I thank everyone so much for joining me today. And Jamie, thanks for facilitating.
Thank you, and thank you for your participation today. A special thanks to Homestead for bringing us this insightful session. As a reminder, membership to a credit reporting organization is your accreditation board selection, and membership number is your license number. For further inquiries, contact ASA at info@asaaging.org or visit www.asaaging.org for details on upcoming webinars, including Exploring Other Dementias, LBD, FTD, Vascular, and Mixed on September 4th. Thank you again, Lakeland, and everyone here today. We appreciate you very much.